There are names in true crime history that, for reasons both chilling and tragic, refuse to fade from memory. Names that surface in quiet conversations, in faded newspaper clippings, or in the hushed retellings passed down through generations. Georgianna Lovering is one of those names. A young woman whose life should have been marked by ordinary joys, fleeting struggles, and the steady rhythm of daily existence, but instead became defined by her death. Her story is not one of spectacle or notoriety, but of horror and sorrow, and of questions that even now remain unanswered. When we look back at cases like hers, we're confronted with unsettling reflections. How could something so brutal happen in a world that outwardly appeared safe? How could a life so full of potential be extinguished in such a merciless way? And perhaps most haunting of all, why have the shadows surrounding her death never truly lifted, even after more than a century has passed? Georgianna's case reminds us of the darker undercurrents that have always existed, even in times we often romanticize as simpler or safer. She wasn't a figure of fame, nor was her story destined for history books. She was an ordinary young woman, living a life like so many others, until one day everything changed. What followed was a horrifying crime, one that not only shook her community at the time, but still echoes with an eerie resonance today. This isn't just the story of a crime. It's the story of a life interrupted, of a family left with questions, and of a community grappling with fear and disbelief. The details, though sparse, paint a disturbing picture, one of brutality, mystery, and unanswered questions that continue to trouble anyone who comes across her story. And so, we return to the haunting case of Georgianna Lovering, not only to revisit what happened on that tragic day, but to try to understand the world around her, the investigation that followed, and the lingering mystery that still clings to her name. Because even though the decades have passed, her story remains one of those unsolved true crime mysteries that refuses to let go. So tonight, as we step quietly back into the shadows of the past, we invite you to reflect with us. What happened to Georgianna Lovering? And why, after all these years, does her case continue to haunt? Before her name became entangled with whispers of tragedy, Georgianna Lovering was simply a young woman trying to find her way in the world. Born in the mid-19th century, she grew up in New England, in a time when life was quieter on the surface, but still marked by social pressures, family expectations, and the struggles of daily survival. For most people who knew her, Georgianna was remembered not as the subject of a mystery, but as a daughter, a friend, and a woman full of promise. Accounts describe her as bright, gentle, and sensitive, a kind of presence that left an impression without demanding attention. She was not wealthy, nor did she live in a way that would have drawn the eyes of the wider world to her doorstep. Instead, she was rooted in the familiar rhythms of her small community, helping with household duties, assisting her family, and navigating the expectations placed on young women of her time. Georgianna's family meant everything to her. They were ordinary people, not distinguished by wealth or influence, but by the bonds of closeness and shared responsibility. In those days, families often depended on one another in ways we sometimes forget today. A daughter was not only a beloved child, but also a helping hand, a source of stability, and in time, a symbol of hope for the future. For her parents, Georgianna's well-being was their priority, and for Georgianna herself, pleasing her family and doing what was right was simply second nature. Like many young women of her age, she was caught between innocence and maturity, at the threshold of adulthood. She had begun thinking about her future, about what kind of life she might carve out for herself, perhaps even about marriage, though whether she had a suitor is lost to history. What we do know is that she carried herself with dignity, and her neighbors recalled her as kind-hearted and thoughtful, qualities that earned her quiet admiration. Life in her town was likely a mixture of simple joys and unspoken struggles. Evenings might have been filled with candlelight, reading scripture or letters from friends, or sharing conversation around the dinner table. Days were occupied with chores, long walks, and errands. For Georgiana, there was a sense of order and routine in this life, but also dreams that were interrupted far too soon. Perhaps what makes Georgiana's story all the more haunting is that she could have been anyone. She wasn't wealthy, she wasn't connected to scandal, and she didn't live in the kind of spotlight that typically breeds intrigue. She was simply an ordinary young woman. And in that ordinariness, we find something deeply unsettling. The reminder that tragedy doesn't only strike the infamous or the extraordinary. It can reach into the lives of the most unassuming, in the quietest of homes, in the gentlest of souls. Friends remembered her smile, though faint traces of those recollections have been blurred by time. She was not known for flamboyance or rebellion, but rather for a steadiness that drew people to her. People in town trusted her, respected her, and spoke kindly of her. In many ways, she embodied what her society expected of a young woman. She was modest, hard-working, and obedient to family and faith. Yet, even within this portrait of quiet normalcy, there lingers the thought of what she might have become. Would Georgiana have one day built a family of her own? Would she have lived to see children grow up around her, or to watch her town change and expand with the shifting years? These are questions that remain painfully unanswered, and they deepen the sorrow of her story. To understand Georgianna Lovering is to understand the devastating contrast between the life she lived and the crime that claimed her. She was not someone who courted danger. She was not reckless, nor was she a person who seemed destined for tragedy. And that makes the horror of her death all the more jarring, all the more heartbreaking. When we think about her now, it's important to remember that she was more than a name in an old case file. She was a daughter who laughed and dreamed, a friend who offered comfort, a young woman who carried her own hopes for the future. Her story resonates precisely because she was so ordinary, because her life, before it ended, could have been anyone's. And so, before we step into the harrowing details of what happened on that fateful day, we hold on to this image of Georgianna Lovering, a young woman full of quiet promise, rooted in family, faith, and community. A woman who should have lived an ordinary life, but whose name instead became forever linked with horror and mystery. The morning of July 4th, 1872, began like any other for 19-year-old Georgianna Lovering. It was summer in Manchester, New Hampshire, and the town stirred with the anticipation of Independence Day. Neighbors prepared for gatherings. Flags fluttered from porches, and the streets carried the faint sounds of children laughing in the distance. But for Georgianna, the day was meant to be quiet. She had planned only a brief walk, nothing out of the ordinary. At least, that was what everyone believed. Around 10 a.m., Georgianna was seen leaving her family's modest home. A neighbor, Mrs. Ellis, later recalled, "She was walking quickly, as though she had somewhere to be, but she didn't say where. She just gave me a polite smile, the way she always did." That smile, as fleeting as it was, would be one of the last living memories anyone had of her. By 11 a.m., she was spotted again near the edge of town, carrying nothing more than a small handkerchief. Witnesses said she seemed distracted, her gaze occasionally darting toward the ground as if deep in thought. One man even noted that she paused several times, glancing over her shoulder as though aware she was being watched. Whether this was imagination or a genuine sign of unease has never been fully settled. Shortly after noon, Georgianna was seen walking along a shaded path that wound through a wooded area not far from a local mill. It was a familiar route, one often used by townsfolk to cut across toward the quieter outskirts. Some said she appeared to be meeting someone, though no one could confirm it. One witness, a young boy fishing nearby, later claimed she wasn't alone for long. I saw a figure standing by the trees. A man, maybe. But when I looked back again, they were both gone. That single testimony would later haunt the investigation, raising questions about whether Georgianna had arranged a secret meeting that morning. By the mid-afternoon, the routine of daily life pressed on, and Georgiana's absence was not yet alarming. Her family assumed she had gone to visit a friend or run an errand. After all, in those days it wasn't unusual for a young woman to step out for hours without explanation. But as 3 p.m. approached, unease began to creep in. Georgianna had not returned, and the Loverings were a family accustomed to punctuality. When dusk fell around 7:30 p.m., concern turned to quiet panic. Her parents sent word to neighbors, asking if anyone had seen their daughter. Some had caught fleeting glimpses of her earlier, but by evening it seemed she had simply vanished into thin air. The day, meant to be filled with celebration, instead descended into uncertainty. By 9 p.m., a small group of townspeople gathered, lanterns in hand, to search the wooded trails where she had last been spotted. Their voices carried through the trees as they called her name, but the woods answered only with silence. One searcher later admitted it felt strange out there, like the air had shifted somehow. We kept expecting to see her step out from the shadows, but she never did. The search continued well into the night, stretching past midnight when the first grim clue appeared. Near the edge of the woods, not far from a clearing, a scrap of fabric was found tangled in the underbrush. It matched the pale dress Georgianna had been wearing. A little further along, impressions in the dirt suggested a struggle-scattered footprints, a faint drag mark, and then nothing. The trail ended as abruptly as it began. By the next morning, July 5th, the town was gripped by fear. Georgianna Lovering, the quiet, gentle young woman known to so many, had vanished. Rumors spread quickly. Some whispered that she had run away, though those who knew her best dismissed the idea immediately. Others speculated about foul play, pointing to the mysterious figure seen near the woods. What makes the timeline of that day so haunting is how ordinary it began and how abruptly it turned. Nothing about the early morning suggested danger. Georgianna was not known to take risks, nor was she in the habit of keeping secrets. Yet somewhere between that polite smile at 10 a.m. and the discovery of her torn dress hours later, something unimaginable happened. Critical questions remain. Why was she walking alone that morning? Did she agree to meet someone? If so, who? And what about the boy's account of the figure in the trees? Was it real, or was it the invention of a frightened child? The strangeness of these details has never been explained, and each one adds to the suffocating uncertainty of her final hours. By nightfall, on July 4th, the Lovering family's world had shattered. What should have been an ordinary summer holiday became the darkest day of their lives. The image of Georgianna stepping out the door that morning, unaware of what awaited her, lingers like a wound that never heals. Even now, more than a century later, the timeline of that day feels fragile, almost incomplete. A handful of sightings, a few uncertain details, and a scattering of physical clues are all that remain. The hours between Georgianna's smile at the doorway and her disappearance are a haunting void, one that swallows both certainty and peace. When word of Georgianna Lovering's disappearance spread across Manchester, the reaction was immediate. In a town where everyone seemed to know each other's routines, a missing young woman was not only unusual, it was terrifying. By the early morning of July 5, 1872, the Lovering family had already reported her absence, and the local police were brought in to investigate. Their arrival was marked by urgency, but also by limitations. In those years, investigative methods were rudimentary at best, and what we now consider essential fingerprinting, trace analysis, or modern forensics simply didn't exist. Instead, investigators relied on observation, word of mouth, and the often unreliable memories of witnesses. The first step was retracing Georgianna's last known movements. Officers canvassed the town, knocking on doors and speaking with anyone who might have seen her on July 4th. The early witnesses were consistent on one point. Georgianna had left home mid-morning, walking with no apparent destination. Mrs. Ellis, the neighbor who spoke with her, emphasized how polite and calm Georgianna had seemed. The boy who claimed to have seen her with a shadowy figure in the woods was questioned repeatedly. Some investigators dismissed his story as the overactive imagination of a child, while others noted the detail with unease. Evidence was sparse, but what little was found carried disturbing weight. The torn fabric from Georgianna's dress was collected, carefully preserved in the hope it might point to a struggle. Nearby, trampled earth and what appeared to be drag marks suggested she had not left the woods willingly. But without scientific tools, the police could do little beyond note their presence. One officer even admitted later, "We saw what looked like a fight, but the ground told us no more than that." It was like trying to read a book with half the pages missing. From there, attention turned to potential suspects. The most obvious theory centered around a stranger or drifter. Independence Day had brought crowds into Manchester, and it was not unusual for unfamiliar faces to pass through town during celebrations. Some residents reported seeing a man loitering near the wooded path, tall and unkempt, though descriptions varied wildly. Was it the same figure the young boy claimed to have seen? Or was it simply a coincidence, a case of the community's fear shaping their memories? But suspicion did not stop with outsiders. Investigators began to consider those within Georgianna's circle. Friends and acquaintances were interviewed, their words dissected for inconsistencies. A few mentioned that Georgianna had seemed withdrawn in the days leading up to July 4th, as though preoccupied with something she could not share. Did this hint at a secret relationship? Or perhaps a looming conflict that had gone unnoticed by her family? The ambiguity left investigators torn between believing Georgianna had trusted someone enough to meet them in the woods and fearing that trust had been fatally misplaced. One name that surfaced more than once was a young man known to admire her. Some described him as infatuated, others as harmless, but whispers grew that he might have sought her out that morning. When questioned, he denied any involvement, insisting he had not seen Georgianna that day. Lacking hard evidence, the police could not charge him, but his presence in the investigation lingered like a shadow. Even years later, some residents recalled the tension in his voice when he was questioned, as though the weight of suspicion had never fully left him. Conflicting witness statements only deepened the mystery. While some claimed to have seen Georgianna alone on the wooded path, others swore she was in the company of a man, though no two descriptions matched. Was he tall or of medium build? Dressed neatly or in workman's clothes? The contradictions muddied the timeline, and without a clear consensus, investigators struggled to separate fact from rumor. The lack of forensic capability was a crippling limitation. At a time when footprints were judged by eye rather than preserved, and when fibers or hairs were seen as irrelevant, the few tangible clues were overlooked or mishandled. Reports suggest that the scrap of Georgianna's dress was passed among townspeople before being properly secured, tainting any chance of learning more from it. The drag marks, photographed only in words, faded quickly under the weight of searchers' boots. What might have been critical evidence in modern times was lost in the fog of Vav. 19th century procedure. The case also drew rapid attention from the local press. Newspapers seized upon the story, amplifying both fact and speculation. Headlines spoke of "a young lady vanished without a trace" and the dark specter haunting Manchester. Reporters painted Georgianna as the embodiment of innocence, a gentle soul stolen from her family by an unseen hand. While this coverage brought the case into public consciousness, it also fueled rumor. Each retelling seemed to magnify the mystery, creating a swirl of suspicion that often outpaced the facts. As weeks passed, the investigation took strange turns. Tips poured in from neighboring towns, each stranger than the last. Some claimed to have seen Georgianna alive, walking with a man along distant roads. Others suggested she had been abducted and taken elsewhere, though none of these leads proved credible. One particularly bizarre report alleged that Georgianna had been seen boarding a train in disguise, as though she had orchestrated her own disappearance. While the police entertained these claims long enough to pursue them, they all collapsed under scrutiny. There were also accusations of odd behavior within the police force itself. Some townspeople felt the investigation lacked urgency, noting that certain suspects were dismissed too quickly, while others were hounded without evidence. Whispers spread that favoritism and personal grudges influenced decisions. One rumor even claimed that evidence was deliberately overlooked because it implicated someone with connections in town. Whether true or not, the perception of incompetence eroded public trust, leaving many to believe Georgianna's case had been mishandled from the very beginning. By the end of the summer, frustration had grown palpable. The Lovering family, desperate for answers, pleaded publicly for anyone with knowledge to come forward. Friends organized searches and vigils, while townsfolk speculated endlessly about what had happened. Yet the trail grew colder with each passing week. Leads dwindled, and without new evidence, investigators could do little more than circle back to the same uncertain testimonies. Looking back, it's striking how fragile the investigation was, how easily potential breakthroughs slipped away. Every witness statement contradicted another. Every clue seemed partial, as though the truth hovered just beyond reach. And with the limitations of the time, there was no way to preserve the evidence that might have changed everything. In the end, the investigation left more questions than answers. Who was the figure seen in the woods? Was Georgianna lured there by someone she trusted, or was she simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? Why did the police hesitate to pursue certain leads with more vigor? And how much of what was reported in newspapers was truth, and how much was embellishment born of fear? What remains certain is that Georgianna Lovering's disappearance became more than a local tragedy. It was a wound that cut through her family, her community, and even the institutions meant to protect them. The investigation, flawed as it was, reflected both the desperation of the time and the haunting reality that sometimes, despite every effort, the truth slips through our fingers. When a young woman vanishes under mysterious circumstances, the first place investigators often look is not toward shadowy strangers, but toward the people already in her orbit. And in Georgianna Lovering's case, many believe the most obvious answer lies close to home, that her disappearance, and likely murder, was the result of an obsessive suitor whose advances she either rejected or could not escape. The theory begins with a young man who, according to multiple accounts, had long admired Georgianna. Some described his interest as earnest and devoted, others as intense and unwelcome. Friends recalled seeing him follow her at social gatherings, his eyes fixed on her even when she avoided his gaze. He was known to walk by her house more often than seemed natural, lingering just a little too long in the hope of catching sight of her. In a town as small as Manchester, such behavior did not go unnoticed, though at the time it was perhaps dismissed as the persistence of youth rather than a warning sign of something darker. Motive, in this case, appears clear. If Georgianna had spurned his advances or even gently declined a proposal of courtship, it could have fueled a sense of humiliation and rejection. In the social climate of the late 1800s, where reputations and pride held immense weight, such rejection might have cut deeply. For a young man struggling with feelings of inadequacy, the blow could have been enough to spark resentment, even rage. And if his obsession ran deeper than simple attraction, he may have felt entitled to her attention, an entitlement that turned deadly when denied. Opportunity also fits neatly within this theory. The man lived close enough to know her routines, to anticipate the paths she walked, and to recognize when she was alone. On the morning of July 4th, with the town's attention fixed on celebrations, he could have easily intercepted her without drawing suspicion. The wooded path where she was last seen was secluded, providing the cover he would need. If the torn fabric and drag marks did indicate a struggle, who better to have orchestrated such an encounter than someone familiar with her movements? But while many are convinced by this line of reasoning, others are not so certain. There are details that don't quite add up. For one, there was no concrete evidence tying him to the scene. Witnesses could not definitively place him near the woods at the time of her disappearance. When questioned, he insisted he had not seen her that day, and without forensic tools, investigators had little to challenge his denial. His nervous demeanor under questioning, often cited as suspicious, could just as easily have been the natural response of a young man suddenly thrust under the harsh spotlight of public scrutiny. Furthermore, not everyone agreed that Georgianna had rejected him. Some acquaintances suggested she may have been cordial, even kind toward him. If that was the case, then why would he have harmed her? The suggestion that he snapped under the weight of unrequited love may sound compelling, but it rests on assumptions rather than proof. Another sticking point lies in the lack of a body. If this suitor was indeed responsible, what became of Georgianna? In a small town where news traveled fast and search parties combed the countryside, how could he have concealed her remains so thoroughly? Did he have the resources or cunning to make someone vanish without leaving a trace? For skeptics, this is the largest hole in the theory. A crime of passion, after all, is often messy and impulsive, not the kind that allows for a body to simply disappear. And then there is the question of character. While his behavior may have been unsettling, was it truly menacing? Those who defended him described him as awkward but harmless, a young man more prone to daydreams than violence. They argue that painting him as the culprit may have been less about evidence and more about the community's need for a scapegoat. In times of fear, it is easier to point a finger at someone familiar than to accept the terrifying alternative of an unknown predator lurking in the woods. Still, for many, the theory of the obsessed suitor remains the most logical explanation. It ties together motive, means, and opportunity with a simplicity that appeals to common sense. It also reflects a tragic pattern seen in countless other cases. A woman's autonomy met with violent resistance from a man who could not accept her choices. Yet the absence of physical evidence, coupled with conflicting witness statements, keeps the theory from reaching certainty. The truth may lie within the obvious, but it may also lie just beyond it, in details overlooked, in possibilities never fully explored. Perhaps Georgianna did meet with someone she knew that morning. Perhaps she trusted him enough to walk into the woods, never suspecting his intentions. Or perhaps the story was never that simple at all. If the theory of the obsessive suitor represents the obvious explanation, then the alternative is far more unsettling. Could Georgianna's disappearance have been the work of a stranger, someone with no connection to her, who slipped into Manchester unnoticed and slipped away just as easily? It's a theory that unsettles many because it leaves no sense of closure or control. The idea that a random predator could strike in broad daylight on a holiday when the town was alive with festivities is frightening. And yet, certain details in the case raise the possibility that Georgianna's fate may not have been tied to anyone she knew at all. Some witnesses claimed they saw an unfamiliar man wandering near the wooded path in the days leading up to July 4th. Descriptions were vague, medium build, dark clothing, perhaps carrying a satchel. In a time before photography could capture strangers on street corners, these recollections were fleeting, almost dreamlike. One farmer told police he saw a man I did not recognize near the boundary of his property, walking slowly as though surveying the land. He thought little of it at the time, But after Georgiana's disappearance, the memory weighed heavily on him. Could it be possible that Manchester was not as insulated as its residents believed? The late 1800s saw increasing movement of itinerant workers, peddlers and travelers passing through rural towns. A stranger would not have stood out immediately, but their anonymity could have given them the perfect cover. If Georgiana had encountered such a person, alone in the woods, she may have been an opportunity, an unlucky victim in the wrong place at the wrong time. This theory also gains traction when one considers the eerie thoroughness of her disappearance. No body, no belongings, no clear trail. For a crime of passion committed by someone local, the cleanup seems improbably clean. But for a stranger, a person who had already planned to leave town, carrying with them whatever secrets they held, the act might have been chillingly efficient. Commit the crime, vanish by train or wagon, and leave Manchester searching in vain. Still, there are aspects that give pause. If Georgiana was taken by a complete stranger, how would they have managed to overpower her without drawing attention? The torn fabric and signs of a struggle suggest a violent encounter, yet no one heard screams or cries for help. Was it simply the noise of holiday celebrations that drowned out her voice? Or was there something else, perhaps an element of deception that lured her into a situation where she could not call out? Some speculate that Georgiana may have trusted the stranger, at least initially. Could he have posed as someone in need, perhaps, asking for directions, or offering assistance of some kind? In that moment, her natural kindness may have left her vulnerable. This unsettling idea that her compassion could have been used against her haunts the narrative with a quiet cruelty. And then there are the darker whispers. Stories of traveling salesmen with reputations for impropriety, or drifters who vanished just as quickly as they arrived. None were ever linked definitively to Georgiana's case, but their presence in the region has been noted in passing accounts. One lead even suggested that a known criminal, operating under an alias, had been spotted in New Hampshire that summer. The trail was weak, but it raised the possibility that Georgiana's disappearance was part of a larger, more sinister pattern. It's hard not to wonder if this theory lingers precisely because it resists neat resolution. Unlike the suitor theory, which points to someone known and familiar, this version offers no comfort. It suggests that Georgiana's fate was sealed not by the choices of those around her, but by sheer, terrifying chance. That she encountered someone whose face no one could recall clearly, whose name no one ever knew, and whose presence in Manchester lasted only long enough to change its history forever. For some, this theory feels too open-ended, too hollow. It relies on gaps in memory, fleeting impressions, and the fear of the unknown. Yet in cases like this, the absence of certainty leaves space for such unsettling possibilities. After all, the woods where Georgiana disappeared were not fenced off from the wider world. They were open, exposed, just as she was on that fateful morning. Whether stranger or suitor, the end result remains the same. Georgianna Lovering was gone, and Manchester was left with a mystery that offered no peace. The stranger theory does not give us someone to blame, but perhaps that is why it continues to unsettle. It forces us to confront the possibility that sometimes tragedy comes not from within our circles, but from beyond them, from the faceless unknown that slips in and out, leaving behind only questions. In the immediate aftermath of Georgianna Lovering's disappearance, Manchester seemed unwilling to believe that such a tragedy could remain unsolved. Families joined search parties, neighbors scoured the woods, and newspapers carried her name for weeks. Yet as the days turned into months, and the months into years, the case began to fade not in significance, but in clarity. The trail that had once felt so urgent grew colder with every passing season. One of the most frustrating aspects of the investigation was the absence of conclusive evidence. Authorities found only fragments, torn fabric, disturbed earth, accounts of sounds and movements that could not be confirmed. For a case built largely on testimony and circumstance, these traces were not enough to hold. Without a body, without clear proof of foul play, the investigation remained trapped in speculation. Witness memories, already fragile, grew hazy as time passed. What had been sharp in July felt uncertain by winter, and soon even the most confident recollections became clouded with doubt. The town itself began to fracture under the weight of light. Suspicion. Neighbors whispered about neighbors. Some looked to Georgiana's family, searching for hidden truths. Others clung to the idea of the spurned suitor, convinced that jealousy had turned fatal. And yet, no charges were ever filed. The longer the case went on without resolution, the more the theories multiplied, each one built on the absence of certainty rather than the presence of fact. For Georgiana's loved ones, the emotional toll was immeasurable. Her family lived in a limbo of grief without closure, unable to mourn fully, yet unable to hope. Every new report of an unidentified body, every whisper of a confession in a neighboring town, stirred up both dread and fragile expectation. Each lead that fizzled out left them more hollow, more exhausted. It is one of the cruelties of cold cases. Hope itself becomes another weight to bear. Public frustration also grew. Manchester, like many small towns of the era, prided itself on being safe, close-knit, and protected from the dangers that plagued larger cities. Georgiana's disappearance cracked that illusion. Parents warned their daughters not to walk alone. Doors were bolted earlier at night. And as years slipped away without answers, the case became less about one young woman and more about the unsettling possibility that anyone could vanish, without warning, without justice. Even so, the mystery never fully left the public consciousness. Periodically, new tips would surface. Anonymous letters arrived at the homes of investigators or local newspapers, claiming knowledge of Georgiana's fate. Most proved unreliable, riddled with inconsistencies or clearly written by those seeking attention. Yet the occasional detail, something about the way her dress was torn, or the location of a supposed sighting hinted at knowledge that could not be easily dismissed. There were also moments when it seemed the case might reignite. Decades later, as forensic methods advanced, some suggested revisiting the fragments of evidence that had been preserved. Could fibers, soil samples, or even the torn fabric itself still yield clues? Unfortunately, much of it had been lost or degraded with time. The 19th century had not anticipated the demands of modern forensic science. What might have been solvable today was simply beyond reach then. What lingers most is the silence. The silence of the woods where Georgiana was last seen. The silence of the unanswered questions. Who was with her? Why was she targeted? Where was she taken? And why did no one come forward, not even in later years, when the people involved, if local, would have been long past the point of earthly consequences? That silence has become the defining feature of the case louder. In its way, then any confession could be. Cold cases, especially those from the century past, rarely find resolution. But they do not disappear. They echo, carried forward by the retelling, by the questions asked again and again. In Georgianna Lovering's case, the trail grew cold not because people stopped caring, but because the evidence could not keep pace with the mystery. The questions remained, while the answers slipped further and further out of reach. And so Manchester was left with an absence, a name, spoken in hushed tones. A story told with unease, a reminder that safety is never as absolute as we want to believe. Georgiana's disappearance remains suspended in time, an unfinished chapter that continues to haunt those who stumble across it. Even now, more than a century later, the trail is cold. But the echoes of that day still linger, waiting for the truth that has yet to surface. Thank you for joining me in revisiting the haunting story of Georgianna, Lovering, a young woman whose disappearance continues to echo through time. Cases like this remind us how fragile truth can be and how easily it can slip into silence. Have you heard of Georgianna's story before? Do you believe the most accepted theory, or do you feel there's something deeper left unexplained? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you find yourself drawn to these quiet, haunting investigations, forgotten stories that still leave questions lingering, consider subscribing. There are so many more unsolved mysteries, cold cases, and unsettling crimes to explore together. Until next time, stay safe, take care of each other, and remember, some stories never truly end.